Thank you. That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 13670 in the name of Jamie Hepburn on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Agricultural and Rural Communities Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak to the motion should press their request to speak button now. And I call on Jamie Hepburn to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 13670 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings on the Agriculture and Rural Communities Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is Scottish Parliament Bill 33A, the marshalled list and the groupings of amendments. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes for the first division of the Stage 3. The period of voting for the first division will be 45 seconds. Thereafter, I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak buttons or enter RTS in the chat as soon as possible after the group is called. Members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. And we move to Group 1, Overarching Objectives of Agriculture Policy. I call Amendment 18 in the name of Ariane Burgess, grouped with Amendments 19 and 20. Ariane Burgess to move Amendment 18 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This Agriculture and Rural Communities Bill is critically important as it will set the way forward for how our farmers and crofters are supported to grow food and respond to the climate and nature emergencies. Our land is our biggest natural defence against climate change and home to the majority of biodiversity, and it is also home to people, and rural communities are a crucial part of that picture. This bill gives us the opportunity to transform how we support rural communities, to steward our land, produce our food and take up new opportunities and therefore to thrive. Agriculture is the dominant land use in Scotland and is associated with almost a fifth of climate emissions, and as agriculture on the whole continues to intensify and consolidate, it drives biodiversity loss. Forestry also has a major implication for climate and nature, some positive and some negative when it comes to large monoculture plantations. So we need to get this right. My amendment number 18 relates to the overarching objectives of agricultural policy, and it would add the words "and between farms" into Objective C, the facilitation of on-farm nature restoration, climate mitigation and adaptation. Adding between farm recognises the importance of ecological connectivity between farms. It's not necessarily about funding activity on land between farms, but it would remind ministers to consider the impact that agricultural policy will have on that in-between land. And it would also encourage the development of policies to promote landscape-scale efforts to restore nature and to mitigate and adapt to climate change. After all, climate change and nature are not confined by each farm gate. Turning to other amendments in this group, Rachel Hamilton's Amendment 19 would add to the objectives the acknowledgement and preservation of the traditions and cultural role of farmers and crofters. I think I'm hearing somebody. Yeah, Rachel.
Rachel Hamilton. The intervention. I just want to be clear before we decide how we're voting on Amendment 18, what specifically the outcome would achieve by adding the description "and between farm."
Ariane Burgess.
I think, as I've said, what I'm keen to see happen is that we acknowledge that things don't, what happens on farm doesn't stop at the farm gate, and you've got issues that move across the whole of an area of land. And what I want to see happen is that we really ensure that we're supporting that large-scale landscape collaboration between farms and between different land managers. So just finding my place again. So I was talking about Rachel Hamilton's Amendment 19 about the acknowledgement and preservation of the traditions and cultural role of farmers and crofters. And we all recognise the importance of farming and crofting to Scotland's culture, but I am concerned that the wording here is not clearly defined enough and could lock us into preserving practices that are damaging to nature and climate. And I'm sure this is not Ms Hamilton's intention, but an objective to preserve traditions could be taken to mean no change. And we know change is needed. So the Scottish Greens would want to see more nuance around this. Ms Hamilton's Amendment 20 seeks to remove the power for ministers to amend the objectives within this bill, but it is standard practice for bills to include a power like this, and there could be good reason to add to the objectives in the future without requiring a completely new bill with all the parliamentary time that it requires. Presiding Officer, thank you, and I move Amendment 18.
Thank you. I call Rachel Hamilton to speak to Amendment 19 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to my amendments and the other amendments in this group. Amendment 19 creates an additional objective of the bill to acknowledge and preserve the traditions and cultural role of farmers. Many farmers and crofters I've spoken to tell me that they feel that their way of life is under threat, with legislation passed at the time by other parties except the Scottish Conservatives in this place, such as the Hunting with Dogs, Wildlife Management and Muirburn Bill, which have impacted their ability to, for example, control predators and protect important biodiversity. We know that the SNP have a track record of bringing forward legislation that does threaten lives and livelihoods, such as those of the coastal communities with HPMAs. So I'm very concerned that the cultural role and the existence of farmers could be under threat if we don't recognise it on the face of the bill. Agriculture has played a central role in society, shaping landscapes, economies and communities. Agriculture is more than an economic sector. Farmers are seen as experts within their communities, supporting livelihoods, heritage, landscapes and environment. Stating this implicitly in the objectives on the face of the bill seems appropriate to cement their unique place in rural society. And change, as Ariane Burgess has almost dismissed, she wants change, but she's dismissed the cultural significance of farmers. But if we look at something like rewilding or reintroduction of certain species, they have had a distinct impact on the livelihoods of farmers, and they haven't been recognised, or farmers haven't been engaged. For example, reintroduction of beavers in the Cairngorms, that has had a distinct impact on farmers. Turning to my other amendment in this group, in stage 2 an amendment was brought in which provided by regulation the power to amend the objectives of agricultural policy, with any amendments done so through an affirmative procedure. The updated supplementary delegated powers memorandum notes that, I quote, "This will provide flexibility that allows the Scottish Ministers to ensure that those objectives stay aligned with future Scottish agricultural policy needs. This ensures that the section 1, brackets 1, close brackets, objectives can remain relevant over time." Amendment 20 in my name removes the ability to amend the objectives, therefore removing the risk of fundamentally changing the policy direction of this bill should the ministers wish to do so. And hearing Ariane Burgess's explanation of her Amendment 18, whilst I understand the connection and the connectivity between farms and farming enterprises, which is so important for our ecology, I do not believe that there is a distinct connection to this bill, and therefore that there would not be an outcome that could be achieved by inserting those particular words. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In terms of Amendment 18, during the Stage 2 committee session, I highlighted that Section 1 sets out the key objectives for agricultural policy, which is why one of the objectives specifically refers to on-farm support. And the objectives seek to link agricultural policy and food production intrinsically with the need for there also to be on-farm nature restoration, climate mitigation and adaptation. Now, the bill does enable a much wider range of support, but Section 1 is focused on agriculture and it is not the place for any wider objectives in themselves. It is clear in any event, well, it's not clear what is meant by between-farm nature restoration, and I think when it comes to legislation, it should be unambiguous. Now, I have discussed with Ariane Burgess at meetings in recent weeks. The bill already includes powers that enable ministers, should they wish to do so, to support farmers, crofters and land managers to contribute to achieving landscape-scale outcomes, and that includes funding for third-party support to deliver grants and support to enable such collaborations to occur. So I would therefore ask Parliament not to support Amendment 18. Looking now at Amendment 19, the culture and traditions of farming and crofting are very important, as Rachel Hamilton outlines, and of course they will be worth preserving. Indeed, the powers in the bill are wide enough to enable ministers to provide support for traditional activities. But even so, this amendment doesn't tell us what is meant by traditions and culture or how ministers might go about meeting that objective. So the effect of the amendment is therefore too uncertain, and I think it detracts from the other objectives that we have in Section 1. So for those reasons, I'm not able to support Amendment 19. On Amendment 20, I know that Rachel Hamilton is seeking to reverse an amendment by Colin Smith, which was agreed at Stage 2. I've sought to ensure that the objectives of the bill were drafted sufficiently broadly and at high enough a level to capture the vision for agriculture and ensure that we do have that flexibility as to how that's going to be realised. Yes.
Rachel Hamilton.
Take an intervention. Thank you for taking the intervention. But on the DPLR committee, they had warned against using Henry VIII powers, and that is what I am concerned about. And this was specifically from the DPLR committee, which my colleague Tim Eagle sits on, which they considered a couple of weeks ago.
Cabinet Secretary.
Reference to another power, but I'm more than happy to be corrected if I'm wrong in relation to that, because what I think is important about Colin Smith's amendment, and as we considered it at Stage 2, I recognise that over time it might be appropriate to then change the objectives of agricultural policy, because this is on the whole a framework bill. So I don't see any reason to reverse that change that we agreed to at Stage 2, and I don't think there's a good reason to do that either. So that's why I would ask Parliament not to support Rachel Hamilton's Amendment 20.
Thank you. And I call Ariane Burgess to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 18.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Regarding my Amendment 18 to add between farm to objective, I do appreciate the Government is wary of signalling that they would provide support to land between farms from the agricultural budget when the budget is limited. It's not my intention with this amendment to signal that, and I don't think it does. Instead, it merely reminds us that the goal to restore nature and tackle climate change is everywhere. It would encourage ministers to keep that in mind when designing agricultural policy, which does have impacts on climate and nature beyond the farm gate. I hear the points put forward by Rachel Hamilton, and I just want to say that, as I said already, we all certainly recognise the importance of farming and crofting to Scotland's culture, but I'm still concerned that the wording is too broad and that it could lead to continued support for practices that are not compatible as we start to understand the impacts of climate and or reversing the decline in our natural world. On Amendment 20, the Cabinet Secretary has outlined why it's important that ministers retain the power to amend this legislation, and the Scottish Greens agree. And I would ask members to vote for my Amendment 80 and not support Amendments 19 and 20. I press Amendment 18.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore there will be a division, and as this is the first division off the stage, I will suspend for around 5 minutes to allow members to access the system.